Welcome to AIPAD Talks. I am Andra Russick of Scheinbaum and Russick in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the chair of the AIPAD Education Committee. And we are pleased to present AIPAD Talks. As you may know, AIPAD is dedicated to creating, maintaining high standards in the business of exhibiting, buying, and selling photographic art. With that in mind, we are so excited that the photography show will once again be held at the Park Avenue Armory in a week and a half from now. This is an exciting return for us to this venue, and we hope that you will be able to join us. Tickets are available online at apad.com. I also welcome you to go to the website and check out the show page for the show, where you can view the catalog. You can see our talks programs, the book signing events that will be happening, and you can also find past AIPAD talks on the website. I want to let all of you know that this talk will be recorded and available on the AIPAD website in a certain amount of time. We are getting ready for the show, so it might take a week or more to get it up there. But with further ado, let me introduce our guest today. Artist, producer, and director David Raymond's work includes film, photography, art, and interactive media. His video works have been shown in Paris, New York, Berlin, Los Angeles, and Miami. David was a founding board member of Performa, advisor to the Getty and the Manuel Alvarez Bravo Foundation, among many other things. He is one of the world's experts on surrealist photography. He is currently developing a dramatic streaming series about the surrealists called Surreal Love. David has been collecting photographs for the past 30 plus years. His focus has been on surrealist, experimental, and contemporary works. Dr. William Jeffett is chief curator of exhibitions at the Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. His doctorate is from the Corcoran Institute of Art, where he studied with Christopher Green. He holds degrees from Oxford University, Yale University, and the University of Texas. Formerly, he was the curator at the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts. He is an active researcher and writer. He has curated exhibitions all over. And this upcoming exhibition that he is curating with David is called The Subversive Eye, Surrealism and Experimental Photography from the David Raymond Collection. This exhibition will open in the middle of November, but we're happy to get a preview of it now. And so without further ado, let me pass this off to both David and William to take us into the world of surrealism.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've never done this before. I've usually been on Zoom calls where you see everybody's faces. So hello, everybody, even though I can't see you. William and I have known each other for a couple of decades, and we knew each other socially, and both obviously knew that we were in the surrealist world, but never had an intersection or opportunity to work together until I visited his museum a few years ago. And I have to say, that place is a gem. The collection is impressive. Their temporary exhibition space is impressive. And I said, I would love the opportunity to work with you. So about a little less than a year ago, William reached out to me and said, do you want to talk about doing an exhibition from your collection? And I said, yes. So we went back and forth about what it would be. We thought we'd maybe do the surrealist and modernist stuff with contemporary pieces that fell into that realm too. But we finally decided to just focus on the work from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I had no idea that initially that they wanted to do something as comprehensive as they're doing, but pretty much it's going to be all of the works currently in my collection that fit in that category. And they're going to be publishing a book too. So needless to say, I am tickled beyond and excited to be working with them.
We're very excited about the opportunity of doing this exhibition. And of course, one of the areas we're most interested in of surrealism is this important period that was also the height of Dali's work. And photography was so central in the 1920s and 30s to the Surrealist project. And yet sometimes it's been a little understudied, and I think your collection is a tremendous opportunity to really look in depth at this period and all of the incredible innovations, some technical, some using unorthodox strategies to produce or construct images, and at the same time explore a kind of surrealist poetic realm that goes in many different directions, whether it's towards dream or towards curious enigmas of modern life. And so it's a great opportunity for us, and we're very, very excited about it.
William and I had a conversation this morning about we realized that there have been very few exhibitions about surrealism, surrealist photography in particular, until the 80s. And that wasn't so long ago. And it's amazing that it wouldn't have been taken on until then, but here we are now, and surrealism really pervades so much of our world. So William, interestingly enough, worked with Don Ades, who was one of the contributors to the L'Amour Fou exhibition and catalog, which was the first major exhibition to take on surrealist photography. And it was that catalog that changed my life trajectory and showed me that these amazing people, and obviously Man Ray is the gateway drug to surrealist photography, but besides him, I wasn't aware of all the others that had contributed so greatly. So that changed my life. And Dawn is going to be contributing to the book that the Dali is publishing for this exhibition. So it's all come full circle.
Yeah, and I had actually seen that exhibition. I saw it. It went to 2 or 3 different cities, I think, but I saw it in London, the L'Amour Fou exhibition, and it was really quite something, really amazing. But it's very core to surrealism, the role of photography. From the very beginning, they put, sometimes rather arbitrarily, they would put photographs in their publications, little magazines, or like La Révolution Surrealiste. They put Atget and other photographers rather appropriating that work. But then, of course, in the 30s, they developed a whole elaborate sort of scenario of publications with lavish images juxtaposed with text. And then, of course, André Breton, the leader of surrealism, deployed in some of his novels, like Nadja and L'Amour Fou, photographic images to complement in one way or another this sort of narrative, the rather curious, fluid narratives that he would develop that often had to do with wandering through the streets of Paris by night. And such ideas became very widespread in surrealism, and yet, as you said, David, it's odd that historians took some time to take on board this interesting dimension of the surrealist movement. And of course, this is the year of surrealism, the anniversary, the 100th anniversary, this coming autumn, of the publication of the first manifesto of surrealism.
And William, you bring up a really good point about how photography was dropped into so much of what the surrealists did. Obviously, surrealism began as a group of writers, and those brilliant creatives ended up bringing in photographers, filmmakers, painters, sculptors, the whole milieu in Paris in the 1920s. So photography was obviously an easy medium to reproduce and to express ideas along with word. I mean, you want to talk about the great marriage. I remember in my marketing class in college, the concept of a great image and a great tagline create brilliant, memorable advertising. The Surrealists had that down beyond. They were probably the first propaganda creators in the best subversive way.
Yes, and it's interesting because I think because of the success of so many surrealist artists, whether it's Miro or Picasso or Dali, Andre Masson's endless list, Magritte, who also made photographs. Popularly speaking, we've come to think of surrealism as a sort of visual arts movement, when in fact it's, as you say, it's a poetic and literary movement that was instigated by writers and over time brought in artists. And yet now the artists receive a lot of attention, perhaps more than the writers in some ways. But you know, hopefully we will, through looking at this dimension of surrealism, still be able to recover something of the literary origins of why these kind of images are so key to the movement.
And that's something that I was very impressed by in our discussions with you and Hank, that you want to include the Eluard book. I have a book by Paul Eluard in the collection that has images by Man Ray and Dora Maar of Noosh Eluard. And then there's a book by a Belgian surrealist named Marcel Lefranc that has his poetry paired with images. And it was important to the museum to include the text of these books too, at least in portion, to share how the words related to the images and vice versa.
So, and this is key throughout surrealism, this kind of dialogue between image and word, and in many ways, I think photography is an ideal medium to create a sort of visual metaphor, much as one would create a poetic metaphor. And the surrealists, of course, stretch the idea of metaphor to its absolute limit, sometimes pushing beyond any kind of conventional sort of sensibility. But therein lies its importance. Plus, I think surrealism, it's not exactly a kind of style of writing or a style of painting. There are huge differences between both surrealist artists and surrealist writers. So it's more of a kind of sort of vision of the world, a kind of not exactly a philosophy, but it's a kind of attitude in front of the world, and not so much something that can be reduced to one idea of style, either literary or visual.
Should we share some images?
Sure.
Why don't I get that going? All right. How do I do this? Okay, I can do this. Share screen. Share. Okay, everybody, thanks for your patience. I'm going to get this on play. And this was an early acquisition. Eugene Atget, as was mentioned, he was not officially a surrealist, but his work was naively surreal, and he inspired the surrealist quite a bit. And this is a key late piece by him that you can see it would definitely be considered surreal. Do you have anything to add about it?
Well, I mean, I know that, you know, Man Ray and some other people in the world of photography kind of came across Atget in the early to mid 20s, and of course they used some of his images in their surrealist little magazines that they published. And then, you know, he didn't live that much longer. He died, but he had kind of this a huge, interesting body of work taken often in the street in Paris, often at night, and a whole series of things like this that are sort of shop windows, mannequins in the market, the street markets. And the surrealists encountered a sort of sense of mystery and revelation in these works, and in a sense probably contributed hugely to recovering the importance of that jade.
For sure. And obviously, Man Ray, this was a self-portrait with possibly Bernice Abbott taken in 1928. And he's taken probably a cocktail glass and placed it over the lens. And how amazing back then. Can you imagine seeing an image like this and the manipulation and what that could have caused you in terms of looking at this misshapen image? I love it. And it's above my bed.
It's fantastic. And so they explored all sorts of distortions in photography, inventing new approaches and techniques, and like you explained with this particular piece, but they did all sorts of other things with solarizations, double exposures, so they could create ghost images. Or maybe sometimes they would set up something deliberately for the camera that would be very enigmatic. And even when they did things that you could say are a little bit more leaning towards the documentary realist tradition of photography, they often approached it in an offbeat, quirky way that that subverted the idea of the straightforward photograph.
Dora Maar, I adore her. I first encountered her work in a large way at her auction, the auction of her estate in 1998. I'd known of her work through her better known pieces, but going to that sale was a revelation. And I became a fan. It was quite obvious she was more than Picasso's doormat and a brilliant, brilliant visionary. And so I started collecting her work pretty heavily. 32 pieces are now at the Cleveland Museum from my collection, but I now have 18, which will be in this exhibition. And this is one of the great ones from it.
Yes, and I have by chance happened to be able to see the Dora Maar exhibition in Paris at the Centre Pompidou. And I noticed walking around the exhibition a number of pieces from your collection that sort of stuck in my memory quite a lot.
I am so glad. Another great, Lee Miller, who was also in the shadows of Man Ray for so long, but what an incredible artist too. And I happened to find this vintage exhibition print that she had signed, which made me swoon. And that's an important thing with regards to specifically my collecting. I try to only collect vintage work. And obviously the quality of the paper, the mount, the age. I also think about how many people throughout time have lived with this object and the stories they could tell. And then the other piece is, there are some times that I'll love an image, but it will be impossible to find a period piece. And if I like it enough or love it enough, I will compromise and purchase a later print. I know that sounds a little out there, but no, it's me. I can't help myself. I want something that's from the period as best as I can.
Yeah, and Lee Miller was quite well known during her lifetime, but the totality of works that were seen in public was relatively reduced. And after her death, her son, Tony Penrose, discovered the enormity of the body of work that she had. There's thousands and thousands of negatives. And from that point onward, slowly people began to see the much wider range of her work that had been known publicly in the 1920s and 1930s.
But interestingly enough, during her lifetime, I believe she only had one-person show at Julian Levy Gallery in the 30s.
Yes, and otherwise some things were published in different magazines and things like that. And then, of course, the famous war photographs that come a
Yes.
little bit later, that were published in Vogue and had such an impact. It's an interesting problem. But what was discovered is this really broad range of work, and that she carried on later on doing quite a lot of photographs. And of course, she was very close to Picasso and any other artist, and took photographs of all of them, which is quite an extraordinary thing. Many of them, of course, very involved with surrealism.
Ah, Hans Belmer, another remarkable, crazy, fabulous being. What can I say? The stuff is so warped and incredible. These dolls that he constructed and then photographed and rearranged and rearticulated. This is one of my favorite images. It's actually his brother hiding behind a tree with the doll in the foreground, and then he would hand color them with these bright, brilliant colors. And yes, I can't say enough about him. He was published in Minotaur, and he became, if not like a core member of the group, he was always considered a surrealist. And he collaborated with Paul Eluard on a beautiful book called Les Jeux de la Poupée, which this image is a part of.
Yeah, a very fascinating figure who also exhibited with the Surrealists, and was included in, for example, in the exhibition of Surrealist objects held at the Galerie Raton in 1936. And very fascinating, and also rather unusual in relationship to some of the other ones, though there are many sort of points of contact. And he had set off on this doll project partially as a kind of way of trying to make find a way to work that could not be reduced to or instrumentalized by the difficult political situation of the period he was living in. So he turned his back on anything that was commercial. I mean, he'd had experience in graphic design and things like that earlier on, but he no longer wanted to make that kind of work, and he didn't want to make something that could be assimilated to the tense political situation that he was living in.
Georges Hunier, who was a brilliant collage artist and a central figure within the Surrealist movement, and he collaborated on many books with the Surrealists. This image came from a book called, what was it called? I can't believe I'm drawing.
The Septième face du Dé, the seventh face of the die.
No,
or is this a different one?
This was a different book. I'm having a brain freeze. Sorry, everybody. But it was a book that wasn't published until 1969, although all of the collages had been created in the late 30s, early 40s. So amazing. He did it as a parody of the Michelin Guide. And all of these incredible, quirky, surrealist collages, many on photograph, which this one is a part of that series, were in it.
So in the exhibition, we're also going to take a kind of fairly expansive view of photography that would include photo montage and collage and some related, almost non-photographic procedures.
Sorry about that. Jumping to Brassai, who was definitely the documenter of Paris at night. And if you look closely at this image, it's called Two in One Suit. You can see the man on the left, his head is blurred because it was a very long exposure. I love his work too, and there'll be a few images by him included in the exhibition.
And of course, he was another figure very, very close to avant-garde positions, to surrealism. Apart from another aspect of his work, which was his wonderful photographs of Picasso's sculpture, which almost transform our understanding of them into something very, very different than some kind of standard reproduction of a work of art. So a key sort of player in the movement, and whose images appeared in many of these surrealist reviews that we're discussing. That again, like at J, there's this kind of mysterious nightlife element going on in this particular piece.
I'm remembering the name of the Hunier book, Huit Jours de Trébomec. My brain's still working. Yay.
Yeah, and on the Huguenet point, I guess it's worth mentioning that he was, you know, putting those collages in relationship to text, poetic text. So it's another. So you could understand collage with its sort of cut and paste aesthetic as related to the way that kind of radical metaphor was deployed in poetry.
Manuel Alvarez Bravo. I've loved his work for a long time. And in 2003, I bid on another example of this image, Parabola Optica, on behalf of the Getty at the Andre Breton sale. And I had longed to own a vintage print of the image. And this came along at AIPAD about 10 years ago. And this print was exhibited at the 1940 Surrealist exhibition in Mexico City. So again, thinking about stories that these images could tell, I can't imagine the stories that this piece could tell if it could speak. But I love it, and it is a masterpiece of surrealism, even though, interestingly enough, he did not consider himself a surrealist, but he was drawn into the surrealist world by Breton, and his work was also published in Minotaur.
Published there alongside texts by Breton related to Breton's travels in Mexico. But this is an extraordinary image because it has in multiple places the idea of the sort of detached eye, so that could be related to the eye of inner vision, and it's very enigmatic because he sort of flipped the negative when he did the print of it, so that it looks like something that is logical, and yet it's quite disturbing because it's kind of undermining the normal legibility of a photograph. I mean, it'll play that sort of role in the exhibition, but also be related to our idea of exploring mannequins and shop windows. So it fits into a pretty broad strategy that a number of surrealist photographers explored.
I know that there is one print in existence that used to be in the Graham Nash collection of the positive print, but I haven't seen another. Henri Cartier-Bresson, another artist who was not considered an immediate member of the Surrealist movement, but his work was incredibly surreal, and he hung out with all of the artists, and he showed at Julian Levy Gallery, along with Manuel Alvarez Bravo and, of all people, Walker Evans. So all these intersections. I actually got to meet him, and I asked him about this image, and he paused, closed his eyes, and then he said, "It's of a boy who's just thrown a ball in the air, and he's waiting for it to come back down." Perfect. I mean, I never would have imagined that. It looks like it could be potentially a violent moment, but what a moment he captured.
It's interesting that it was taken in Spain, in Valencia, in 1933, just 2 or 3 years prior to the onset of the Spanish Civil War, and it almost feels like it has something to do with that, even though it's a little bit before, during the period of the Republic. So, and it must be said also that Breton included Cartier-Bresson in some of his sort of prose novel writing. So probably in a way appropriated to a degree by Breton, but still, here is Cartier-Bresson, the more enigmatic side of his work, than with a direct relationship to literary surrealism.
Absolutely. Also on the periphery, but very surreal, is Umbo, Otto Umbacher, who was part of the Bauhaus movement. And he did this series in 1928 of mannequins in store windows that was used as an illustration for an article in a German publication. And sadly, the work is rare because most of it was destroyed during the war. So vintage prints rarely come up. And this piece had actually been exhibited at Julian Levy Gallery, probably in 1931 or 1932. And I was very fortunate to come across it. I heard a story about him. The great collector and dealer, Timothy Baum, shared with me that he met Umbo in Germany, and Umbo was working as a ticket taker at a children's park. He was basically in obscurity, and that's what he was doing in the latter part of his life. I know that Corcoran Gallery ended up reissuing a portfolio of some of his great images, and the man was super important and should be receiving much more acclaim and attention than he has up to this point.
Yes, this piece fits in with our kind of idea of exploring as one of the sub themes the mannequin, and there's something very kind of intriguing and yet disturbing in this fascination with mannequins that so engaged the surrealists.
Another German artist, Heinz Hagekalka, and to me, this is one of the great examples of photomontage. This was done around 1928, if I'm correct, and just before Photoshop. Look at the precision of this image. And it's magical and dreamy. It has all of the elements of a surrealist image that you would want.
And yeah, it must be said, you mentioned Bauhaus, and of course, many of the German artists were aware of things that were happening in France and elsewhere, but of course, were engaged in varying degrees with Bauhaus. The exhibition also has quite a few Czech artists in it, and they also looked towards the Bauhaus as well as to Paris.
Absolutely. Now we jump to Japan. The famous exhibition, Film and Photo, and a Surrealist exhibition ended up in Japan. And you had all these camera clubs in Japan that were doing beautiful imagery that was, for the most part, pictorialist. When those exhibitions were seen, all of a sudden, these photographers started to experiment. And I was fortunate enough to discover the work of Osamu Shihara and collected his work pretty extensively. He was active for the most part, in the 30s and the 40s. And I mean, just look at this. You can see so much influence, but he definitely developed his own style. And another image I love. This was one of the first photographs that I bought by him.
A really intriguing artist, and it is fascinating to see how these ideas kind of radiated throughout the world in a very sort of international way. But his poetic is absolutely in sync with surrealism, though there were some other writers and artists very kind of directly engaged with surrealism. And in some ways, Osamu Shihara's work is more interesting than theirs. And he was engaged with this club, the Tampei Photo Club, as David suggested, that there were all these kind of fragmentation of clubs that explored all these interesting and intriguing ideas.
going to the Eastern European artists, Jaroslav Russler, another one of the greats. And this is a self-portrait from the late 20s. You can see him hiding there behind the camera if you look closely. And just, again, profound, powerful, and totally surreal.
Yes, and intriguing how he's kind of turned vision back on itself. So it's a kind of series of reflections and mirrors almost, in a way, playing with the idea of the lens and so on.
And coming to the United States, there was a group in Chicago who was playing with surrealism, and Nathan Lerner was one of the key proponents of that movement there, and another great surrealist image from the early 40s.
There's a kind of disembodied eye of inner vision, quite extraordinary.
With nails coming up, I wonder what he'd have to say about that.
Yes, I suppose also the somehow the threatening of the eye is in a way.
I never thought about that. Absolutely. I'm going to have to ponder that. So we're going to pause here with a slideshow, and if there's time, I'll share some contemporary work from the collection that is related to surrealism too. And we'll continue our dialogue, William. So
do you want to do you want to get quickly look at the contemporary, or
we can jump back to it.
Okay.
I want to know from you what inspired you to want to do the show and focus on this broad-based look at surrealism through photography.
Well, one factor was thinking about the centenary celebration of surrealism, and the other was, as I had a growing inkling of the extraordinary quality of your collection, I just felt it was a really great option. And even Dali didn't make photographs, but he had written a lot in the late 20s about photography, and there were a couple of articles from the 30s as well, and it's clearly important for him, both theoretically and perhaps even in some paintings he's used photographs to construct the composition. To really look more carefully at photography seemed like a good thing. And we haven't done a lot of photographic exhibitions, but we did a Lee Miller exhibition. Right. And we had done an exhibition that explored the relationship between Duchamp and Dali, that had some photographs of Duchamp related to Huguet's projects and things like that, so that are quite intriguing. And of course, Duchamp also used photography in many ways. So these were kind of aspects that I was particularly attracted to.
I don't know if you noticed, but here is Salvador right here behind me. He doesn't have a lot to say, but he's watching over us. So, William, what else should we speak about here? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's the question, how did you get initially engaged with the whole idea of surrealism, even before you kind of got attracted into photography?
Well, for me, I've always been interested in imagery, even when I was a boy, that challenged the way I saw the world. It's so easy to look at the world and document it as it is, but how can you challenge me? And when I discovered the group of surrealists through L'Amour Fou, it was so apparent that they were speaking the language that I was looking for. And so I became interested in that work. And I remember I couldn't afford it at the time, but I saw a work by Raoul Ubach at a Christie's sale of the Battle of the Penthesiles of the Amazons. And I just was pining for it, but I couldn't do it. It sold at auction. Many years later, a dealer offered it to me, the very same print, and I purchased it. And that piece is now at the Cleveland Museum. So it's been in my blood. It's been in my dreams. And I even create work that's kind of surreal too. It's just, I live it. We even named our dog Tristan, and our daughter's name is Paloma. So it just goes on. I think
I
I've
mean,
been.
do you think, in a way, I think one could argue that surrealism is remarkably relevant among the wide panorama of 20th century art and literature. It seems to remain very relevant, and I think its capacity to transform itself constantly, whether or not one is a card-carrying member of the movement. I think it's the capacity of art and literature to kind of be in a constant state of transformation that makes it still very, very relevant today, rather than a kind of, uh, relic of the past, as it were.
Oh, it is completely relevant. It's everywhere. I mean, how many times does someone say that's so surreal? And in media, in our culture, there's so much surreal imagery. It is so now, and I think it always will be. I just got a message we should share the contemporary work, so I'll dive
Okay,
in and share
let's
the
do
screen
that.
with everybody. Share. Hey, everybody. Let me get this going again. So I get to experience so much wonderful contemporary work that is surreal to me. And an artist named Jen DeNike, who also happens to be a friend of mine, she's multidisciplinary. She obviously does collage, she does painting, she does performance, she makes films. She's a surrealist. And this, as you can see, it's actually legs of ballet dancers that she's definitely done her own version of Hans Belmer with. And you can see a piece behind me by her from that series. Elena Dorfman, she was one of the first to document these real dolls, as they're called. This was in the 90s. She went to the factory where they make them, and she was able to contact people that lived with them. And she did a whole series, a book that was published called Still Lovers, of people living with their real dolls. Tanya Franco Klein, who is from Mexico. Most of her work is self-portraiture. And I remember meeting her at an Aperture event. She came up to me. She was drawn to a jacket that I was wearing. And she told me that she was an artist. She gave me her card. I went onto her website and I promptly bought this image and another one by her and just love, love, love her work. Ethiopian artist Ida Molinay, also just so surreal and so contemporary at the same time. And I've collected a number of works by her. And my most recent discovery is an artist named Patricia Volgaris, who's based in New York. And her work deals with mysticism, with magic, and very surreal. And it looks like it's from another time. And I love her work and just bought another group of it too. As you probably noticed, all of the artists I've shared from my contemporary collection are women. I've tended to be drawn to the work of women artists for the most part in the contemporary realm. So yeah, that's a little snapshot, I believe, yes, of the contemporary work. There's more. All right, perfect timing. Should we open the space up for questions?
Yes, I think that would be great.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming back on just to read the
Hey,
questions for our panelists here. If anyone has a question, please put it into the Q&A and I will read it for them, and we can go from there. Thank you. The collection is amazing, by the way.
thank you.
Just incredible and lovely. Um, So let me see if any questions pop up, and if not, I have my own questions, but let's give people a minute or two to ask. I do have one question that came in, and it's what is it about lens-based works that draws you in as opposed to surrealist paintings or other mediums?
Ah, I remember going to Chicago Art Fair in 1997, and a dealer had a Magritte painting, This Is Not a Pipe, for sale. And at the time, they were asking $350,000 for it. I coveted the painting. I held it in my hands. If I could have afforded it, I would have bought it in a second. So the price range for photography and painting, at least at this point, is very different. And so photography was an opportunity for me to be able to afford to acquire masterpieces. And in addition to that, it's the immediacy of the work. And it's just been something that I've continued to be drawn to. Not to say that I don't have works on paper by some of the surrealists, and there'll be a few things in the exhibition too.
Excellent, thank you. I have a couple questions here. One, which will be an interesting one to hear your answer. What are your thoughts on surrealism and AI?
I'm going to jump in, and then William, I want to hear yours too. Well, if you think about Salvador Dali, he embraced holograms in the 70s and experimented with them. I believe that if the surrealists from the surrealist period were around now, they would have embraced and gone absolutely wild with AI.
Yes, I think most likely because it probably offers, many possibilities, and normally artists are very fascinated with exploring any kind of approach they have available to them, and I think they would have been very open to this new technology.
And the museum has a dream generator using AI.
Yes, we do. We've done a number of technological projects using AI and other new technologies. So it's an important part of what we do here.
I'm going to go on to the next question. Thank you for that answer. This conversation is fabulous. Can you talk about how photography implies reality so it's a perfect medium to convey the surreal?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I think they're asking you to talk about how photography, the manipulation of photography, can you talk about how that is a good medium to use to convey the surreal?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, when these artists were doing their work, there was quite a bit of technical adeptness that was involved. Now, in our current world, we don't know what's real, what's being shared with us. Everything is being manipulated for the most part. So there was a naivete that existed then in the creative process that opened up our expansiveness of what expansion of what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's more a pause and a level of discernment. So the creativity led to possibly not something not so pleasant, at least in my opinion, as to where we are now. So I look forward to creators making work that has a purity of intention, but that expands the way we see.
Yes, and I mean, I think surrealism took on photography because it didn't see photography as a sort of mode of realism. It saw it as a way to depart from realism into another kind of conceptual realm. And they did odd things. I mean, some of the photographs in the exhibition were not made with a camera. or a negative, that they were working with directly with the paper in one way or another. I mean, they really did push boundaries about what vision could be, and that it could be both something to do with the external world, but also deflect back onto the internal world. And I think therein lies its richness and attraction. But I agree with David that a very kind of authentic approach to that. So the idea of kind of distorting reality with the intention of kind of misleading, which is a potential problem with some new technologies and how they're being used, is a real problem.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep going because we actually have a few more questions coming in. So you just mentioned that you held a painting in your hands. In your collecting, does size matter? Are you drawn to the intimate scale?
That's a great question. It all depends on the work. There are some works that I've been drawn to that are literally this big, and then there are others that cover a wall, contemporary work. And back in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s, it was rare to find a mural-sized work. Not that they don't exist. And I have some large exhibition prints by artists of the period, but for the most part, they are, as some people would say, gems.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, this one's an interesting one. Noticing the Yulesman behind Andra. I wonder if you consider Yulesman a surrealist and whether you have any of his work in your collection.
I don't have any of his work in the collection, and he's definitely a surrealist. And in fact, his work was included in a bunch of surrealist exhibitions that lead up to present time.
Thank you. Just since that's here, and I always like to put something up for people to enjoy looking at when we're doing these talks. So I'm glad someone noticed it. Here's the last question that I have in the chat right now. You focused on still imagery. Do you also collect film and/or video pieces? And if so, what are some of your more favored?
I have some contemporary video work, nothing from the period, although I bought DVDs with work by Man Ray and Duchamp and others from the period. So occasionally I enjoy partaking in them and just being inspired. And in fact, William and I were speaking with the museum staff today about the possibility of me curating an exhibition of surrealist film. So that will be fun.
That sounds wonderful. Um, I have one more question that came up, and if anything else comes up, I will shout it out. But what do you think are the reasons Lee Miller's vast archive was not seen until after she had passed? She was surrounded by contemporaries who knew her other work in print, but were her artist friends not aware of what she was making?
Well, from my knowledge, people were aware. She was the co-creator, if not the creator, of the solarization process. And she also was very active in portraiture at that time, as William had mentioned. And she also took a lot of commissions. She did show in group shows during her lifetime during that period too. And as I mentioned earlier, the only one-person show she had was a Julian Levy gallery. I think that from what I've read about her, the war impacted her greatly, it in not such a pleasant way. And she'd had some trauma in her earlier life that probably compounded it. And even though she didn't remove herself from the world, it seemed that her creativity was buried.
Yeah, I think she, after the war, she didn't really kind of push the idea of working with photography in a professional way, and it wasn't something she sought to do. She carried on her social life, and they would go visit Picasso and other friends from time to time, or those friends would come and visit them, but I think she was just happy to kind of live in and enjoy a little bit her social life, her family, and where they were living in England. And she didn't make a big thing about it, but she kept all the negatives and everything. And so it wasn't something that she talked about constantly with her son, and they discovered all this later on. And there's been a huge, since the beginning of the 80s, more or less, a kind of reappraisal of her work and through a number of exhibitions. And it's been very, very interesting to see that. Of course, her war photographs were quite well known, but I think after that, she was a little less visible. But as I said, I don't think she was sort of seeking it out in a way. I think she was just enjoying her life and her family.
We can't hear you, Andra.
Oh, yes, you're.
I'm sorry, excuse me a moment. There's one more question, and this will be our last one because we're running low on time. So if there's any more questions, I feel as though you can maybe find David at AIPAD next week and ask him yourself when you see him in person roaming the booths. So propaganda was mentioned. What pieces of surrealist photography would have had its strongest effect concerning political propaganda? Is there a photographic Guernica?
Wow, that's
Well, there are the wonderful photographs of the painting Guernica that were taken by Dora Maar, and which are all they're not in David's collection. They're all in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And she documented day by day the evolution of Guernica, and this part of her work is very, very interesting and has contributed hugely to our understanding of what Guernica is. And that would be perhaps one example. I don't know, David, what do you think as regard other?
Well, you mentioned Dora Maar. She went out into the streets in Spain and the UK and documented people out on the streets, which was not, I don't think she was necessarily intending to do documentary work, but she was with her unique eye and just showing what was happening and powerful. There's some images from that series in the exhibition. And I don't even know if it's an official series. It's just her eye and what she thought was important to share. But nothing, that's a really good question. I'm going to ponder that. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much. I hope all of you can get to St. Petersburg in November. I would like to. I'm hoping I can get there at some point in time. I wish you the best of luck on the exhibition. It looks great. There will be a publication, everyone. When we know more about when it's coming out, we will put something out on the AIPAD's Talk website so you can all find it and look for it and get it into your collection. Thank you both so much. So happy to have you here, and we look forward to what's to come in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
I was just going to say that. Thank you for attending at noon on the East Coast. That's pretty amazing. Appreciate you being here.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.